Okay, so this is liable to be another pretty long video in the manner in which the one was the other day with regard to anti-theism, but that's not a sort of new feature that every video I'm going to be making is like this. It's just that this particular style fits in with the things that I want to talk about. This is quite a different subject that I want to talk about today. I want to talk about unions, and this is a response to Academic Agent's video, or pair of videos, brace of videos, the problem with unions. And his videos consisted of a short, what he called a trailer, which was really a series of clips from sort of 50s, 60s, 70s British comedies, parodying some of the worst excesses of unions in the day. And he left me a comment on Twitter saying, looking forward to your counter. But this isn't really a counter, because for this to be a counter, I'd be taking all the things that Academic Agent had done in his video and disputing them. I don't largely want to do that, because I think that the problems that we have with unions are the problems that he brought up. What I wanted to do is to set something, as I said to him, less counter, more counterpoint, something which in some ways is within harmony with what he says, but it's showing a different aspect of unions. Because part of the problem with unions, and what I would suggest is, if you haven't watched his videos, have a watch of his videos, especially if you're somebody who's very pro-union, and try and watch it with an open mind, because unions aren't all sweetness and light, and often the things that they do purportedly under the auspices of it being for the benefit of the members and for society generally, I agree, often in the longer term aren't. And I know this, by the way, because I've lived through a lot of this. This isn't going to be a video quoting report after report or quoting my favourite book in the way that the Academic Agent does. My experience of this is having been a union member, been out on picket lines a couple of times, living in a part of the world that is heavily unionised. When I grew up, the Grimsby docks, the fish docks, which had been one of the biggest fish docks in the world, was very heavily unionised. Immingham docks down the road, which I think by tonnage, I think is the largest docks in the United Kingdom now, very, very heavily industrialised. 2 oil refineries at Immingham docks and all manner of chemical plants there, very, very heavily unionised. I've gone into a job as a firefighter which is very heavily unionised, and of course living through things like the miners' strike and experiencing that as I grew up, and experiencing the change and seeing some of the harm, and having the same feelings that the Academic Agent has towards some of that. So what I would say is, if you're pro-union, it's worth listening to that and try and do as best you can. It's never easy, but listen to that with an open mind. Similarly, if you're somebody that thinks that unions are the worst thing in the world and there's no redeeming features to unions, I would ask you to listen to what I have to say in this video with an open mind as well, rather than just trying to go for the yes but, yes but, yes but, because I'm not denying a lot of the issues with unions. What I'm trying to show is that there's another side to unions and union activity. It is a shame, but for most people, especially people that aren't regularly involved in what unions do, because they're in a unionised industry and because they know what their union is doing, the only time you are liable to come across unions is when there has been the ultimate breakdown between union and management and it's resulted in a strike. That could mean that that particular union is going out on strike for the first time in a couple of decades. What do you think they've been doing in the intervening time? Maybe the thought is that they've just been sat there waiting for something to strike over. But the reality is that unions do a great number of things besides, and those are some of the things that I want to talk about in this video. I want to show that unions are not just about going out on strike over pay and conditions and trying to coerce management into setting unreasonably high levels of pay. But of course we know there is this side to unions, and so I've got to mention it. And I did feel one of the things that I thought was a little bit unfair with the Academic Agent's video was that if you look at the trailer, it has all this old footage from 60s and the 70s, and it's comedy footage, right? These aren't things that really happened. But I've got to say, because I know from the workplace that my father was involved in at the time, actually some of this is not that wide of the mark. things really like that did happen. In my father's workplace, deliveries used to come in on a train. Every delivery, big chemical plant, trains coming in, going out on a daily basis, and they had a signal box to alter the points. And somebody was employed to do that. But as things changed to road travel, they went down to one train a week, and yet they still had somebody employed in that signal box just to change the points twice a week, one to let the train in onto the site, one to let the train back onto the main line again. But they couldn't give him anything else to do because the union would have been up in arms. His contract of employment said that that's all his job role consisted of and that he could have that job until his retirement age. If my father was in charge of a particular plant, if he wanted to have that plant, a piece of machinery isolated, he'd go up to the control room. It just involved flicking a switch and then you'd physically lock out the machine. He was entitled to physically lock out the machine, but he wasn't entitled to physically flick the switch, and he would have to get the person whose job it was to flick the switch. Obviously this is madness and it can't carry on, but the point is that it didn't carry on. And one of the things that I know that I agreed with Backy when I had a chat as part of an interview I did with the academic agent for a series he was making was that we agreed that what happened with Margaret Thatcher with regard to the unions is something that had to happen and was for the benefit of everybody. I would suggest for the benefit ultimately for the unions and the workers as well as everybody else. And a lot of changes took place there. But I feel that in some ways the portrayal that the academic agent has given still seems to be stuck in time in the 70s. Things have changed now. You know, if you want to go out on strike, if we're still talking about strike action, which I will just in this part of the video before moving on, it isn't just a case of men with cigarettes draping out their mouths and flat caps on, going into the back room, having half a pint of mild, and then deciding they're all going to walk out the doors, and then somebody comes through and says, we're going out the bloody doors, you bastard. We're not coming back until you've sorted it. Right, that doesn't happen anymore now. If you want to go out on strike action, if you want that strike action to be protected strike action, which any trade union would want for their members, then you need to go through the proper processes, which usually involves a ballot and not a show of hands. It's usually the Electoral Reform Services, I think, which is, I think, allied to the Electoral Reform Society, who will organise a postal ballot on behalf of the trade union to make sure everything is above board. They will organise the ballot. It's a third party that does that. You will have to give the management a period of, I think, 7 days notice. You need to tell them that you're going to ballot, then you need to give them 7 days notice of the period of strike action, and then the period of strike action can go on for no longer than 12 weeks without another ballot. And a lot of the practices that took place are no longer allowed. Closed shops are banned. That was the business, of course, where to do a particular job, you had to be a member of the particular trades union. That was something that was rife on Grimsby fish docks. The lumpers, I recall the lumpers were very, very well paid back in the day. The lumpers are the people that unload the fish and drag the kits of fish round the docks with like a big metal spike. They were very, very well paid, and although it's pretty unskilled work, to be honest. But the problem was they ran a closed shop, and they had a lot of power because they could just shut the docks down. You had to be a lumper to lump fish, and you had to be a member of the Lumpers Union to be a lumper. So there's got to be an umper-lumper joke in there somewhere, I would think. I'll try and avoid making it. So effectively then, the pay of the lumpers didn't depend upon the value of the work. It depended upon the amount of coercion that the lumpers union could hold over the rest of the fish docks, which is obviously that's not a good thing. And it also led to a lot of nepotism, which is that if you wanted to be a lumper, your best bet was to be the son of a lumper, because it was a closed shop, so they were setting the terms and conditions of who could be a lumper. That had to change. That did change. The business of sympathy strikes, of secondary action, of one union going out and another union going out in sympathy with them, which led to the general strikes which brought the country to its knees in the 1970s. They were made illegal. The business of flying pickets, which of course we saw in the miners' strike, where you're not striking at your place of work. What you're doing is you're trying to intimidate. If another branch has members that doesn't want to go out on strike, you flood that branch with people to try and intimidate them. You know, these are all pretty shady practices. they're not practices that take place anymore. They're not practices that legally can take place anymore. And unions, my experience of unions is that they are very keen to play within the lines, because they know just how it's playing into the hands of management. They'll get into trouble. Their members will be fired if they don't do everything right. So they try and do everything right. So I think that a lot of that's changed. But that's dealing with strike action. Okay. But it isn't all about strike action. That's the bit that catches your eye. That's the bit that you see on the television and you think, fucking unions, all they ever do is go out on strike. But that's only a fraction of what unions do. And indeed, some unions never go out on strike. And we have this idea of unions as being this inherently left-wing thing, don't we? And of course, the Labour Party, the left-wing party in the United Kingdom, their formation is inextricably linked with trades unions. And indeed, most trades unions in the United Kingdom still have a political levy, which I think you're legally allowed to opt out of. But effectively, they're raising money and funding the Labour Party. But I don't think the business of collective representation is an inherently left-wing thing. It's something that makes sense. And so where does the left-wingedness of it even end? I mean, in the fire service that I'm involved in, the Fire Brigades Union is the main union, and that's the union on the ground floor, if you like. And they are a determinedly left-wing organisation, I would say, in their political outlook. But then, as you get into middle management, you can still be a member of the Fire Brigades Union, but there is an officers' union. It's another collective representation, because those people realise that a collective voice is worth more. It gives them more of a voice than if they just acted as individuals. Is that still a left-wing organisation? The people that run the fire services, the chief fire officers, have an association, which is effectively a union under another name, the Chief Fire Officers Association, which again gives collective representation, a collective voice to chief fire officers, and also, of course, would represent any particular member if the local authority that employed them didn't live up to the terms of the contracts of employment. The union would back them up. Is that still a left-wing organisation? If you go beyond that to the captains of our industry, to the managing directors and the chief executive officers of the big, bold corporations in the United Kingdom, they are members of the Institute of Directors, which is a form of collective representation, because they realise that by being represented collectively, it gives them a voice that they otherwise wouldn't have. And the organisations that they are in charge of, those big businesses themselves, are members of the Confederation of British Industry, the CBI, which is collective representation for those businesses. Even on a governmental level, as you go to the European Union, you will find voting blocks. Even the right-wing parties form voting blocks, which again is a form of collective action and collective representation, because it gives them a bigger voice than they would have individually. So I don't see, if there is something intrinsically left-wing about being member of a collective in terms of being represented so you've got a bigger voice, it seems to go into some strange areas. And really, all people are doing when they want to be part of a union is what everybody else wants to be doing. It's not just a working class thing. It isn't just a left-wing thing. People on all sides of the political spectrum and all levels of the social spectrum understand the benefits of collective representation. So I don't think it's a particularly left-wing thing, and I think that's something to bear in mind. But what I want to do is to outline some of the benefits, some of the things that unions do, to set them alongside some of the problems that academic agent brought up. I think one of the most important things that unions do is that when you're employed by an employer, you have a contract of employment, and you have terms and conditions of that contract of employment that place duties and responsibilities upon you as an employee, but also places duties and responsibilities on the employer. The problem is that the employer has the means to enforce it. If you step out of your duties and responsibilities, if you fail to fulfill your contract of employment, then it's very easy for them to clamp down on you. It doesn't work so easily the other way round. Of course, and there's always somebody who will screech in comments, you can take them to court. But really, it's not as easy as that. Many of us don't have the funds to go through a court case, especially given, and we all know how court cases work, if one side has a lot of resources behind them and the other side does not, you know that the side that has a lot of resources can keep kicking it into the long grass, can make the court case last and last and last until you run out. Literally, you just can't afford to carry on anymore. You've gone bankrupt. I think most people, if they're having a small dispute with their management and the grievances isn't being heard properly or the management is acting out of line, aren't going to risk bankrupting themselves on account of that. That's a ridiculous expectation to make. And what unions do in this, and this is a lot of what union work involves, it involves representing individual members and advising individual members, is that they provide some balance. And there can't be anything wrong with balance, can there? It means that the member, you have a contract, a contractual obligation with the employer. So that should put both parties. That contractual obligation is on a level. It has responsibilities and rights for both parties. It puts the employee on a more even footing with the employer when it comes to making sure that both sides are fulfilling the rights and responsibilities of that contract of employment. And that is a lot of what unions do. They're representing members when they're having disputes with their employer. It could be that their employer or somebody, a member of the, under the auspices of the employer, their boss is bullying them. Who's going to stick up for them? That's a perfect case for the union to get involved. It could be that two union members within that workforce are in conflict with one another, in which case unions will often they will provide representation for both members. It's important to understand that in the United Kingdom, if your employer is in dispute with you and they have an internal procedure to deal with that, you are not legally entitled to have a legal representative. You can't go and draft in a legal mind to come and sit. You can't pay for somebody to come and sit in on that. They're entitled to refuse. You are allowed to have what's called something like an accused friend or something like that, okay? A lay person who's part of the workforce to come and sit in with you. The problem is that most people don't have a fucking clue what's going on. The management know exactly how to go through all the procedures, and your mate who works in the same department as you hasn't got any more of a clue than you have. You may be able to hold your hand and make you feel like you're not alone as they're reading you the fucking riot act, but that person doesn't know very much. A union official will. A good union official will have the same knowledge of the procedures and the rights and responsibilities of both sides as the management will have. So again, it's placing both sides on an equal footing. My father was a prime example of this. My father ultimately gave me quite a bad opinion of unions because I saw the way that effectively they dragged his workplace down. Nearly resulted in them all losing their jobs, in actual fact, because this is what unions did in the 70s. They were so antagonistic to management. So gave me overall quite a negative view of unions. But they also did some good work for him. Let me describe what happened. So he worked in a factory environment, but because it was often all hands on deck, although he was in charge of the plant on a shift basis, he was involved in the granulation of fertilizer, taking ammonium nitrate and then putting it into a granular form. And it would clog the machines up at times, and then it'd be all hands on deck to unclog the machines and get the process running again. Time was money. And some of the ducts were quite small, and you had to open up a little thing on the side of the duct, stick your hand in, there wasn't room for you to wear a glove, stick your hand in, smash the sides, then withdraw your hand before all this hot material fell down, and you had to stand on a chair or a stool or something to do it. It wasn't a safe practice. Management had been made aware that it wasn't a safe practice, but they hadn't done anything about it. So my father was doing this particular procedure, and the chair or the stool slipped, and he was left hanging there by his hand, and all the hot material fell on his hand, and some of his workers ran over and lifted him up, and he extricated his hand, and his hand was severely burnt. And the whole thing just blistered up. He was off work for several weeks. Now, without a union, any recourse he would have done would have had to be off his own bat. He would have had to take his employer to court. His employer could have been quite intransigent because they can outlast him. There wouldn't have really been that much pressure on the employer to change things. As it was, because he was in a union, everything went so much more smoothly. The union fought it for him. They went to speak to management. It was all settled. He got a payment for the fact that he'd had his hand burnt on a practice that obviously was not satisfactory, and also the union challenged the management and said, this is not satisfactory, you need to now put something better in place. Let's have a look together at what can be put better in place that would be satisfactory to us as representatives of the people that are going to be doing this job, and satisfactory to you as management, as the people that are going to have to pay to make the changes that are made. And those changes were made. So this is the kinds of things that unions can do, and how they work for people. And this is what they do. And the other thing, of course, that they do is that they represent people on a collective basis. And a lot of what people see with unions is unions in conflict with management. Even the example that I gave you there, effectively they're in conflict with management. But however anti-union you are, something you need to bear in mind, I propose, is that unions aren't always working in opposition with management. And that there are a good union, right? And I can tell you that in my 23 years in unionised industry, in a unionised industry, I've seen both sides of the coin. I've seen unions at a point where they're not prepared to work with management to quite a petty degree, where they'll actually do things to make things harder just for the sake of it. But I've also seen the good side of unions and management working together to try and create systems that work well for both. So this is the positive sides of unions. And one of the positive sides of unions is that actually from management's perspective, having a single point of consultation is a marvellous thing. And there's several reasons for that. One is that there are many changes that management would often like to make within a workplace, but due to contractual obligations, because you've signed a contract of employment that has duties and responsibilities on both sides, the only way they can implement the changes is with the will of the workforce. They need to get the majority of the workforce to agree. It needs to be some kind of consensus amongst the workforce, not an absolute consensus. The wording is a little bit vague actually in the law, but the management has to do that. It has to speak to the workforce and to get the workforce on board to be able to make that change. That's not very easy to do if you don't have a unionised workforce, in actual fact. How do you lay out that consultation? What a union does, especially if they're a majority union within a particular workplace, is provides a single point of consultation. And when the union members give their voice, it's a block vote. Right, I'm sure you can see why that's really, really useful for an employer. Because if you need to get, let's say you decide, okay, we can get 60% of people to agree with this, then we can justify a change which will impact upon the terms and conditions of the contract of employment. But if you've got a union that represents 70% of members, the union will sell it to their members. The union will negotiate. The union will tell you what they want to get out of it. You tell the union. If you can agree it with the union will then go to their members and say, we recommend that you vote in favour of this. And if 60% of union members vote in favour for it, even though that's only 60% of 70%, the union vote is a block vote. So the union is going forward and representing 70% of that workforce and saying, all the union members, we're on board with this. So from a management perspective, it streamlines things, streamlines those kinds of negotiations. And this is something that we're sort of engaged in. I can't say that much because it's live, but in our particular union, particular brigade, with regard to changing to a 24-hour shift system, which the most of the workers are in favour of, the management's in favour of. It seems to benefit everybody. But if it can't be done through the union, and there's some reasons why that might not be the case, that's going to be really, really difficult for management to do, because then they need to be shown that they've consulted with all members of staff and everybody's been canvassed and everybody's had the say in all these kinds of things. Whereas if they can do it through the union, because it's a majority union, it makes it, all those responsibilities then pass on to the union. From the employee's perspective, is advantageous because we're all pretty green on these issues. Your employer comes to you with a major change. It might sound really good, but you don't really know. They've had legal experts looking at it. Who have you? You've just got your own common sense judgment. If you've got those union people that know all about these things, it puts you in a much better position. It gives you that expertise. It gives you a much more informed decision. And of course, the second thing that's really helpful, I think, for management is union knowledge. Might seem the same thing. Why would management be consulting with unions? Because often in particular sectors, unions know more than any individual employer knows about good practice. Why? Because that's the business of the union. If you're working in a sector that is very competitive, employers don't necessarily want to spread best practice with their competitors. If they come up with something that works really, really well for them and works well for their workforce, and a lot of employers would like something that works well for their workforce because it means you've got a happy workforce, it means retention and recruitment is that much easier. They're not necessarily going to say to all their competitors, hey, you want to be doing the same as we're doing. And so if you work for another company in the same sector, those company bosses, if they're looking for a solution, won't necessarily know the details of these other solutions that are taking place. But the union will, because if the union is represented in all these workplaces, they will know the intimate details of each agreement that has been reached. Even in a sector such as mine, the fire service, there's dozens of fire services in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and they all have these different things going on in them. And no fire service is aware of exactly what every other fire service is aware of, but you can bet your boots that the union head office is, because every single thing goes through them. So they know what has been tried, they know what works, they know what doesn't work. They have a bias, and obviously for management to ask the union for their opinions, they're obviously going to be aware that the unions have a bias. The unions aren't really that bothered if it isn't that good for management. The unions only see it from the unions and the workforce's perspective. But what they do know is that, well, this brigade has already tried it. It didn't work very well. This one has abandoned it. This is why. This is what people thought of it. So they can provide a lot of useful information to the employer that the employer otherwise would really struggle to get hold of. The third thing is, one thing that academic agent brought up was the business of health and safety, and he doubted that unions had made any contribution whatsoever seemingly to health and safety, which seemed a little bit bizarre. He seemed to suggest that, well, management would do these things anyway because it's not in the interest of management to have people injured. I presume it wasn't in the interest of mill owners to have their workers have their arms and legs decapitated by machinery that didn't have any guards on them, but nevertheless they didn't seem particularly motivated of their own accord to do anything about it. I don't really buy that. I think you need legislation and you need pressure in various forms for health and safety legislation. And one of the things is that a lot of the concerns that you have in different industries, whether it's the asbestosis and emphysema suffered from people working with asbestos, the emphysema that was suffered from mine workers, whether it's the contaminants that it's believed within my industry, that the products of combustion that could affect your health. These are effects that happen decades down the line, in most cases probably after you've retired. So there really isn't the same compunction on management to do anything about it for two reasons. One, because it's very difficult on an individual basis to prove that is unequivocally the thing that has caused your condition. And the second thing is people manage for the here and now, not for 30 years away. If you're in charge of an organisation, you want that organisation to be seen to be doing better during your tenure, not 20 years after you've retired as head of that business. So just because it's going to have some counterclaims in the dim and distant future isn't really going to impact upon your thinking, I would suggest. So I didn't really buy that. But in terms of health and safety legislation, actually a good union and a good management with a healthy relationship can work together very well. And let me explain the kinds of ways in which this can happen. For example, in my own workplace, we do a lot of training off-site. A fair amount of training off-site. And if you want to train on somewhere off-site, that site needs to be assessed to make sure that it's safe. If it's a dock, is it slippy? Is it all covered in algae? Is there a chance that somebody could slip and fall over the side or smash their head on the concrete? Okay. If it's a disused building and you're doing a training exercise in smoke, right? Are all the floors safe? Is the iron spike stuck out the fucking wall, right? These things actually happen. Are all the guardrails that are there, any of them loose? If they are, can measures be put in place? All these things need to be highlighted. A risk assessment needs to be done for health and safety, right? Because you shouldn't be training in an environment that's going to seriously endanger you. You should be training in a safe environment, as safe as it can be, and still legitimately do the training. So the management will need to sign off on that site. They'll need to do their health and safety checks and sign off on that site. And if something goes wrong, that's going to be dragged out. And what's going to be brought to them is that this wasn't done properly, or that effectively you were so keen to be training that you disregarded the safety of the people doing the training, right? And you didn't take account of things which any reasonable person could have took account of. So what management will do in those circumstances is they will go to the union and they will invite the union to make an assessment as well, right? That benefits everybody. It benefits the members of the union because somebody who is unequivocally on their side is making an assessment, but it's also of great benefit for the management. And unions do these kinds of things all the time. This is bread and butter work. Going out on strike is not bread and butter work for a union. This is bread and butter work for a union, making these kinds of assessments. And what's in it for the management is that if something goes wrong, let's say regrettably somebody does break their leg, what can't be said is that that risk assessment was carried out in a cynical manner by management, because somebody acting on behalf of the individual that's broken their leg, in fact, has signed off to say, yeah, we're happy with it. Somebody, their representative, has said, yes, we're happy with this as well. So that puts the management in a much better position. They've covered their bases, they've shown good faith, and nobody can look at that risk assessment. The risk assessment could still be wrong. And one of the other advantage, of course, unions is the unions might pick up on something legitimate that the management assessor has missed, but nobody can turn to the management and say, well, you just weren't interested in the welfare of your staff. And anybody who would have picked up on this on the risk assessment, because somebody like that was, which was the union representative. So that's why they do these kinds of things. So when you take all these things into account, the collective representation, the fact that unions are representing people on individual issues, that they can work with management, that can be for the betterment of management. A good union working for the betterment of management can provide a focal point within which management can interact with the workforce and can actually support the management in coming out with things which work well, right, which are better, which are improvements for the management and for the workforce as well. The academic agent says this himself in a way, in that he says it's not true to think that everything that employers do is antagonistic to their workforce. Often it is in their interests to find solutions that work for the workforce, because in terms of retention and recruitment and happy staff. If that's the case, then working with a union is no problem, because what unions will do is they will point you at the kinds of things which will work well for their members. So this is the thing. The whole landscape has changed. We still have conflicts with unions. Unions are still the same as management or anything else. If you give them too much rope, they will hang you, them, and every fucker else besides, right? This is the problem. But so will management, effectively. And for me, somebody who believes in free market economics, who sees the benefit of that, but sees that that depends upon attention. If you have a monopoly, it doesn't work. You need a tension between different companies to give you all those different benefits. You need that competition that gives you the investment, the lack of apathy, the drive forwards, the increase in efficiency, all the good bits that you get, right? That gives you an iPhone and a Samsung S8. You don't get that with a monopoly. And it's the same thing with the union and management. That if you have a situation where the management has all the power and the unions are impotent, that is not an ideal situation, because the management doesn't really need to take account of the workforce properly there. If you have a situation where the unions have all the powers and the management becomes effectively impotent, which is the situation that is shown in the academic agent's clips, that is no better. Again, you're effectively heading towards a monopoly of power there. Coercion will take place again. And it's easy for the academic agent to say, well, the management wouldn't do these things because it isn't in the long-term interest. You could make the same case with unions. If unions have ultimate power, they won't do these things because it's not in their interest. It just doesn't work that way. Management and unions both think pretty short-term. Certainly that's been my experience in everything that I've observed with unions throughout my life. Put them in tension with one another. Get that little balance of power right. Then it becomes in their interest to work together and find solutions that work for both. That's probably where I should leave it with regard to this. If you haven't watched the academic agents videos on this, have a watch. I hope you've listened to this with an open mind, and I hope that for some people it's shown, if you weren't already, if you did start off with a really, really negative idea of unions and only view unions through the lens of people going out on strike, that's quite an old model, right? That's dwelling back to the 70s and what's gone on there. Times have changed now, unions have changed, and that only represents a fraction of what unions are about. Okay, that'll do. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.